Hello and welcome to our pre-recorded Bible class for March 6th, 2022. Continuing to look at the witnesses to Christ, people from the life of Jesus. And today we're looking at Herod Antipas, the first, the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Now, of course, when we're talking about Herods in the Bible, Herods in the New Testament, one of the things that's very confusing is, of course, there's a bunch of them. They all pop up in different things, and they're often all called Herod in the Bible, even though history doesn't call them just Herod. And so which Herod is which? Which Herod are we talking about today? Well, here's kind of a simple little family line that shows, because of course all the Herods are related, and we'll talk through them. But the main ones we find in the New Testament here are Herod the Great, from the Christmas story, Herod Antipas, who's the tetrarch, and he's the one who we'll talk about today. Herod Agrippa is the one we find in Acts often. Herod Agrippa II is the one we find at the end of Acts that Paul appears to. And then there's sometimes Archelaus and Philip are called Herod Archelaus or Herod Philip because of their connection to Herod the Great. And of course then you get Herodias, who's Philip's wife, who becomes his wife. We'll talk about that with John the Baptist. We talked about that with John the Baptist, so we'll review that too. All right, so first one. Herod the Great, he lives from about 74 BC to 4 BC, and he's ends up being declared king of the Jews in 37 BC, and he's the Herod that we find in the Christmas story. And so he's a great builder. He's known outside of his role in the Christmas story for being a great builder. He's the one who started the project rebuilding to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Also built the harbor in Caesarea, the fortresses of Masada and Herodium, and the city of Sebasta. But he also is known for his paranoia, his vindictive streak, so to speak, especially towards the end of his life, especially so around when Jesus was born. It was said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. So Herod, he's declared king of the Jews, but he's not actually Jewish. He follows some of the Jewish laws in order to kind of appease the people that he's ruling. But that's not necessarily his thing. But one of the ways he showed that, trying not to offend people, was that he didn't eat pork. So the pigs around him were safe because he doesn't eat pork. But he had 3 of his sons and many others killed. He was worried that the sons would try and overthrow him, assassinate him, take him out, and so he ends up doing that with them. Ends up killing them along with many others. And so when we read about, say, the slaughter of the innocents, for example, from Matthew 2, remember that after the wise men find Herod, say they're going to worship the king of the Jews, which, remember, that's Herod the Great's title, and then they go away by a different route and don't come back. Herod, worried enough about that someone else is going to claim to be king of the Jews, has all the boys 2 and younger in Bethlehem killed. So again, that's not recorded outside the Bible, but it's certainly not out of character. And Bethlehem would have been a small enough out-of-the-way town that it might not have been. But in fact, there's some sources say that Herod had 3,000 people in a stadium as he was going to die. That when he died, they were all going to be killed, so that at least people would be mourning around Herod's death, even if they weren't really mourning for him. So that kind of tells us the kind of guy he is. And that somewhat affects his children. They're mostly better, but they still, get affected by that a bit. All right, so then the second Herod is Herod Archelaus, who's the ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. And so one of the things that challenges then is, so Herod the Great had gotten Rome to recognize him as king of the Jews, but afterwards there's some dynastic squabbling between his surviving sons, and so it gets to the point where Rome says, okay, fine, we're just dividing what Herod the Great ruled altogether. We're dividing that up into different provinces, and different what people rule different things. And as we'll get into later too, that Jerusalem, Judea, ends up being directly governed by the Romans instead of governed by a vassal king, just because of how poorly the kings had done in the past. All right, so Herod Archelaus is ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So this was one of the coins that represents him. And he's the one who we find in Matthew 2, the end of Matthew 2. So when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod the Great, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be a Nazarene. All right. And so then the part of what happens here with Archelaus is related to us also again by Josephus, the Jewish historian, who is along with the Romans, and so he's one of the best extra biblical outside the Bible sources for a lot of what's going on in Israel in the time of Jesus. And so in any case, so Josephus tells us that Herod the Great had offended the Jews by placing an eagle in front of the temple, and soon after he died, and the people brought this to Archelaus. Archelaus was not yet officially declared king, so he wanted to wait until he visited Rome to be declared king, and then he'd take care of things. The Pharisees also objected to the Hasmonean priests marrying Greeks. This led to unrest. And the Hasmoneans, they're the same. That's the dynasty that Herod the Great, Herod and the Great and his family are. They're much more. Well, you can kind of tell by the fact that they're able to work for the Romans. They're much more content to work with outside forces as opposed to the Pharisees, who are very, of course, from Jesus we know they're always set apart from other Jews, but they're even more set apart from Gentiles, especially any Gentile rulers is all. And so these priests are marrying Greeks, marrying non-Jews. So unrest, and so Archelaus sends soldiers to the temple area and kills 3,000. When Archelaus went to Caesar, his brother Antipas, who's again Herod Antipas is the one we'll talk about or focus today, objected, but Caesar makes Archelaus king in 4 BC, but by 6 AD Caesar deposed him and put the land under a governor who, at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, is Pontius Pilate. All right, and this episode actually then finds its way into one of Jesus' parable. We actually we went through this parable with the college students on Wednesday night from Luke 19, and so it's right after Jesus meets Zacchaeus, right before he enters into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and so Jesus says, "A nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then returned. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, 'We do not want this man to reign over us.' But and then the parable ends with, 'But for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me.'" So again, Jesus uses this occurrence of what Archelaus did, trying to get himself made king, even if the people didn't want him made king, and uses that in one of his later parables. So then, of course, we deal with. So again, the Herod Antipas is the one we mentioned here, and he's the one we'll get back to as our focus. Then the next one is Herod Agrippa the First. So he rules. He rules from 37 to 44 AD, but by 41 especially, he's the king over all of Palestine. So he gets control of most of what Herod the Great had controlled. And part of why Herod Agrippa gets in power is because he's sent away for training and stuff, and ends up being friends with the people who become raised up as Emperor Tiberius and Caligula. And Agrippa we talked about last week, because he's the one that we heard about in Acts 12. So about that time, Herod the king, and so this is Herod Agrippa. Again, this is why this is confusing. They're just called Herod. So Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword, and when he saw how it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And of course, so we see him do this. But then we also, So he does this, and then we find later on that his pride ends up causing him to die, and then his son takes over, Herod Agrippa II. He rules from 48 to 70 A.D., and he's tetrarch of Chalcis in the northern territories, and he's the one who Paul appears before in Acts 25 and 26. So towards the end of Acts, when Paul's been arrested in Jerusalem and has appealed to Caesar and wants to get his all expenses paid prison ship ride to Rome. And so Paul appears before Agrippa. Again, in Acts 25 and 26, you see Paul appearing in chains. All right. And again, then the other Herods, again, Antipas is the one we'll talk about in detail. And then again, Herod Philip, who ends up being tetrarch of the northeastern regions. And he's ruling from 4 BC to 34, so over a bunch of those places. Most of those places are kind of north and east of Jerusalem, and even north and east of Galilee, on the other side of the Jordan. All right. And so again, these people end up being important because they're the historical figures that we end up using to date stuff with. And so when Luke begins after the Christmas narrative, gets into Jesus beginning his ministry and John the Baptist, then we get into all these people. So in the 15th reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod, this Herod Antipas, being tetrarch of Galilee. Tetrarch is the fourth ruler. So his territory is essentially a fourth of what Herod the Great's was. His brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea, Trachonitis, Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. During the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness, that he went into all the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And of course, so that we see this is the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. And we find even then that Herod, this Herod is the one who deals with John the Baptist, and so he's even, sometimes depicted as having gone and heard John the Baptist. He's curious, and as we see throughout the rest of these readings, he's curious, he's entertained somewhat by John, but he's still kind of angered, but especially more so his wife is angered. So. Again, so we talked about this with John the Baptist at the beginning back in January, but kind of reviewing. So this is Herod, this Herod, who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against John the Baptist and wanted him to be put to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, yet heard him gladly. So, again, Herod seems to like to listen to John, but it seems to be more of a kind of a curiosity, entertaining thing. It's not that he's coming to faith at all. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and leading men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. So, again, seems to be a kind of fickle guy, doesn't like to be embarrassed. So immediately the king sent an executioner with order to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. All right. So again, this is Herod Antipas. Again, we talked about this when we looked at John the Baptist, but he's the one who ends up having John the Baptist killed because John the Baptist is telling him that he shouldn't have. He's essentially committed adultery with his brother's wife. The brother's wife doesn't like her being shamed that way And so ends up being why John the Baptist dies. All right, but then now Herod the Tetrarch, same Herod, heard about all that was happening. This is Jesus doing his ministry. And he was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And Herod sought to see Jesus. And so we see Herod having the same reaction to Jesus that he had to John. We find other places, when the disciples, when Jesus asks the disciples who they think Jesus is, some say a prophet, some say John the Baptist and things. So Herod's hearing those same things. But he wants, and so he's curious about Jesus, again, similar way to what he was with John the Baptist. He's curious, he's perplexed, he's entertained by hearing this, but he's not in any way considering coming to faith. In fact, then, a couple chapters later, we find out that he's kind of ticked at Jesus. So at that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." This is, again, the same Herod. And he said to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course." And so Jesus is teaching in Galilee. The Pharisees come and warn him. Because these Pharisees, at least, they want Jesus to die, or they're still curious about who Jesus is. But whoever he is, they don't want Herod to kill him. But Jesus doesn't seem super concerned, because he knows he's not going to die outside Jerusalem, but he's up in Galilee at this point. All right, but then we get, of course, Jesus in the crucifixion. Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, the trial. And so the chief priests and crowds are urgent, saying, "Jesus stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place." And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when Pilate learned that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him. Again, what we were talking about. Because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, they sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had enmity with one another. And so, again, Jesus appears before this Herod, the trial. But Herod wants Jesus to do something, entertain him, and Jesus doesn't. Jesus remains silent, and so Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. We get this. If you remember the Jesus Christ Superstar. You get that's where you get the lines from this Herod saying, "Show to me that you're no fool. Walk across my swimming pool." Those kind of things. Again, just wants the miracles, the party tricks done that way. All right, but then Jesus appears, but with the soldiers, but he remains silent, and so gets mocked and sent away. All right, so what's this important? Again, we talked about this with John the Baptist a little bit, but again, John the Baptist is mentioned, and Herod, along with Herod, in this book, in the work, The Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. Again, he's the Jewish historian who's alive from 37 to 100, and so is our source of a lot of our extra biblical knowledge. And he writes, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist." We'll get to what that army is here in a little bit. For Herod slew him, John the Baptist, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another, and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism. For that the washing with water would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words. Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best, by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties, by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I mentioned before, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. All right, and so that continues on, and then so this army that they're talking about that destroys Herod Antipas's army, that's why he ends up ending his reign. The army sent by Aretas of Nabatea, who's the father of Herod's first wife. So Herod was married to first, but then he divorced that first wife and got Philip, his brother, to divorce his wife Herodias, so then he could marry Herodias. And of course, his former father-in-law is upset about this and ends up raising an army and trying to defeat him at some point. So, and then he probably could have been destroyed militarily, except for when Tiberius dies and when the emperor's change, and so they run into issues there. And so what's this have to do? So then in 39, Herod Antipas is accused by his nephew Agrippa of conspiracy against the new Roman Emperor Caligula. And so he's sent into exile in Gaul, which is present-day southwest France. Herod's wife Herodias chose to join him, and he dies there sometime after 39 AD. We don't really know for sure when. So I mentioned Agrippa was a friend of Caligula and Tiberius, and so that helps him out in some of these things. All right, so what do we learn from as Herod? Well, we learn that sometimes leaders are sometimes just entertained by Jesus. We learn that they're often kind of fickle in their in what they're doing, and that too that. Here, we'll go to this. Again, we learn that just because he's interested, that he's curious, he's entertained by John the Baptist and Jesus, doesn't mean that he's coming to faith at all. And that sometimes we're going to have unjust rulers. But he still ends up pointing us to Christ because, of course, we only remember him because of Jesus. We don't remember, any of these other rulers at that time. I can't name any, other rulers, governors or mayors or anything from 2,000 years ago, unless they're connected to Jesus. And so we look at that too, and point at the effect of how Jesus had on history. All right, so thank you very much for joining us.